Penguin Random House Audio presents The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam. Read for you by Mark Bramhall. I remember the moment when I first began to understand why I felt so driven on this particular book. I was 1 year into the legwork and had gone to a party for a friend's book. Teddy White, who had been an important role model for me, his Fire in the Ashes had come out when I was a sophomore in college, was off in a corner. I had joined him, and we were talking about American politics. Suddenly another colleague wandered over, turned to Teddy, and asked. I was stunned by the bluntness of the question. It was the kind of thing you might think, but did not dare ask. What is it that makes a bestseller, anyway? Teddy, whose first book about the collapse of China, Thunder Out of China, had reflected much of his pessimism about Jiang's forces, which had been suppressed by his employer, Harry Luce, had surprised us both with his answer. A book that burns in your belly, something that has to be written before you can go on to anything else. He had, I realized in the weeks and months to come, defined not just one of his earlier books, but the one I was working on as well, an account of the origins of the war in Vietnam. That book had its roots in a trip I made to Vietnam for Harper's Magazine in the fall of 1967. I had been appalled and disillusioned by what I found in my 3 months there. The war, despite the optimism of the Saigon command, was a stalemate. Our total military superiority checked by their total political superiority. In effect, this meant we could win any set-piece battle we wanted, but the other side could easily replenish their battlefield losses whenever they wanted. What was even more depressing was the optimism I found among the top Americans in Saigon, which struck me as essentially self-deception. There was much heady talk implying that we were on the very edge of a final victory and that the other side was ready to crack. Invitations were even sent out that December by some high-ranking diplomats asking friends to come to the light at the end of the tunnel Christmas party. It was the same old false optimism I had first witnessed there 5 years earlier as a young reporter for the Times, when the stakes were so much smaller. It reflected once again the immense difference between what people in the field thought was happening and what people in the Saigon command, responding to intense political pressure from Washington, wanted to think was happening. One night, near the end of my tour in 1967, I was invited to Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker's house for dinner. At the end of the dinner, Barry Zorthian, then the chief public affairs officer, who was himself in the process of turning from hawk to dove, and who was trying to dampen Bunker's seemingly unshakable optimism about the progress of events, had set me up with a planted question. "Mr. Ambassador," he had said near the end of the evening, "David Halberstam has been away from Vietnam for 4 years, and he's been back traveling around the countryside for the last 3 months. Perhaps he would share some of his impressions with us." Thus cued, I suggested that we were fighting the birth rate of the nation, that the war was essentially a stalemate, but a stalemate which favored the other side, since eventually we would have to go home. What our military did not understand, I added, was that Hanoi controlled the pace of the war, and it could either initiate contact and raise the level of violence, or hold back, lick its wounds, and lower it, depending on its needs at a given moment. Bunker was considered one of the ablest and least conventional men in the Foreign Service at that moment, although his years in Vietnam did not add luster to his reputation. He was a graceful and courteous presence, and I think this last assignment, with the steadily mounting bitterness which it provoked, must have been one of diminishing pleasure for him. He listened politely to what I said, which was more than one of his predecessors had done. 4 years earlier, an American ambassador had literally thrown me out of his office when I had expressed reservations about an extremely dubious Arvin success. He had, Bunker said, spoken with his generals. He named several of them. All fine men, and they had assured him that, contrary to what I said, everything was on schedule, and that there was an inevitability to the victory we sought, given the awesome force we had mounted against the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. That evening was not the place for a confrontation, and Ellsworth Bunker, with his old-fashioned, almost courtly New England manner, was certainly not a man anyone wanted to be in a confrontation with. As such, what followed was rather mild. His generals, I suggested, were like all Western generals before them, starting with the French, not so much in the wrong war, but on the wrong planet. Their ability to calibrate this war was limited. Their skills were tied to other wars in other places, and with very few exceptions they, like the French before them, tended to underestimate the bravery, strength, resilience, and the political dynamic which fed the indigenous force they were fighting. In addition, the briefings they received from subordinates were always tied to career and promotion. As I spoke, I thought of one of my favorite generals, Bob York, a rugged, craggy-faced ex-boxer whom I had known in my earlier tour and who had always gotten things right. Had gotten them right because when he went into the countryside, he unpinned his stars. With his rough looks, he seemed more like an enlisted man than the West Pointer he was, and people told him the truth. At the dinner, Ambassador Bunker reiterated his confidence, Zorthian having hit a wall, and not for the first time, one suspected, changed the subject, and the party soon ended. I left the ambassador's residence more depressed than ever. The embassy was isolated. It still did not understand the roots, and therefore the strength of its adversary. It was once again telling Washington what Washington wanted to hear, without even knowing. A few months later, the Tet Offensive caught the American mission, both military and civilian, largely by surprise, and undermined the legitimacy of almost everything it was reporting about Vietnam, most particularly its relentless military optimism. What the American Army at the highest levels lost in Vietnam, my close friend and colleague Charlie Moore told me years later, in the best summation of that time, was its intellectual integrity. I returned back from Vietnam to America, properly depressed. A war which was not winnable was going to play itself out with, I thought, terrible consequences for both America and Vietnam. I had little time to ruminate on this, for I spent the coming year covering the growing domestic turbulence caused by the war. 1968 was one of those landmark years in which everything came to a head, or, as in this case, seemed to come apart, marked as it was by the withdrawal of the sitting president from the race, by 2 tragic assassinations, and by a political process which began in the snows of New Hampshire just as the Tet Offensive took place and ended in violence in the streets of Chicago. That year I covered many of those events, and in addition I wrote a small book about Robert Kennedy's campaign. When the year was over, I felt like someone who had been living for too long on the edge of events. I was exhausted, and I had no sense of what I wanted to do next. "What about an article on McGeorge Bundy?" suggested our executive editor at Harper's, Midge Decter, not yet identifiably in her neoconservative incarnation. An article on McGeorge Bundy? A light went on immediately. It was a chance to look at perhaps the most luminescent of the Kennedy people, all of whom had seemed so dazzling when they had first taken office, a chance to look at the Kennedy years themselves from a certain distance, and finally, and perhaps most important, a chance to look at the decision-making on the war itself. Suddenly all my energies were fused. It was exactly what I wanted to do, and I spent the next 3 months working on it. The article, "The Very Expensive Education of McGeorge Bundy," ran 3 times the normal magazine length and caused something of a storm. The general power of print and of a magazine like Harper's was a good deal greater 20 years ago in relationship to television than it is today, and this was regarded as an important article. It marked the first time anyone in any major centrist magazine, let alone a presumably liberal one, had been so critical of a member of the Kennedy administration. Far more important, it was the first time a writer in the liberal center had suggested that the Kennedy administration might be overrated, and that its decision-making on Vietnam was significantly flawed. Up to then, there had been something of a gentleman's agreement among those who might be called the good journalists of Washington, that the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?